Think about how you decide whether a movie is worth watching today. Chances are, before you even buy a ticket or click play on a streaming service, you pull up Rotten Tomatoes and check the score. If it's in the high 90s, it's a must-see. If it's in the 60s, you hesitate, and if it's got that dreaded green splat, forget about it. Over the last 2 decades, we've been trained to reduce the entire medium of cinema down to a sterile binary math equation. But it wasn't always like this. Not that long ago, movie criticism didn't come down to a percentage. It came down to 2 guys sitting across from each other on national television, fiercely debating the merits of a film like they were clerks arguing behind the counter of a local video store. They usually didn't agree, and they often took cheap shots at each other, but in the process, they turned film criticism into something way more valuable than a number. They turned it into a conversation. And when they did agree, they gave a movie the simplest, most definitive rating imaginable: 2 thumbs up. And when they really loved it, 2 thumbs way up. So to understand why movie discourse today feels so flat, let's go back to when it actually felt alive, and take a look at why I miss Siskel and Ebert. As writers for competing newspapers in Chicago, Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert were bitter rivals, who spent years trying to outdo each other. So when they were suddenly paired up to co-host a movie review show that would eventually become At the Movies, that rivalry didn't disappear. If anything, it got worse, because now, instead of competing in print, they were forced to argue face to face, on camera, every single week, as both of them fought for the soul of whatever movie they had just watched. And the best part? They didn't just argue about great films, they'd argue about absolute garbage too. During the review of Three Ninjas Kick Back, Siskel was so baffled that Ebert suggested kids might enjoy it, even if he didn't, that he sarcastically called him Uncle Raj, and insinuated that he was actually taking a bribe from the studio. When they reviewed the children's movie Alaska, Siskel couldn't even process Ebert's positive take, telling him, "You know how I always say I missed the boat? Well, you missed the harbor." And it didn't stop when the cameras cut. There's behind the scenes footage of them trying to film 30-second promo spots, which they can't even get through without bickering. At one point, after Siskel stumbles over his lines, Ebert says that for Gene, speech is a second language. Only for Siskel to fire back that Roger's first language is ordering dessert, taking a shot at his weight. However, the unique thing about all of these arguments and cheap shots is they usually end with both guys laughing. Because beneath the constant bickering, there was a massive foundation of mutual respect, as the two were intrinsically linked through the bond of cinema. In fact, they were the perfect foils for each other, because their very approaches to reviewing films were fundamentally different. Siskel was sharp, cynical, and often abrasive. Ebert, on the other hand, was emotional, empathetic, and deeply attuned to how a movie made you feel. Basically, they were coming at reviewing movies from completely different angles, which meant they weren't trying to meet in the middle, they were trying to prove each other wrong. But beyond the pure entertainment value of watching 2 guys take shots at each other on national television, they offered a masterclass in how to actually evaluate a film. To Ebert, for example, comparing something like The Godfather to an Adam Sandler comedy wasn't just pointless, it completely missed the point of what movie reviews were supposed to be. Ebert had this core philosophy: what is a movie trying to do, and does it succeed? If a movie set out to be a dumb, entertaining comedy and it made you laugh the entire time, that was a success. If a prestige drama aimed for greatness and fell flat, that was a failure. Ebert judged films strictly on their own terms. A cheesy slasher movie, for example, was judged against other cheesy slasher movies. It wasn't about ranking everything on the same scale. It was about understanding intent. Siskel, on the other hand, had an equally brilliant rule of his own that became known as his famous lunch test. When evaluating a movie, he would ask himself one simple question: is this film more interesting than a documentary of the same actors having lunch together? If the answer was no, the movie was a failure. Basically, if a film couldn't make its story, its characters, or its performances more compelling than a completely ordinary real-life conversation, then it hadn't justified its existence. And that kind of logic is almost completely gone now, because modern movie discourse flattens everything into the same system. Siskel and Ebert, on the other hand, didn't do that. They asked much simpler questions. Did it work, and was it entertaining? And that's something modern aggregate sites like Rotten Tomatoes completely strip away. And ironically, out of all of that nuanced contextual debate came the most famous, unnuanced rating in Hollywood history. If they liked it, thumbs up. If they disliked it, thumbs down. No numbers, no decimals, and no percentages. They either endorsed the movie and told you to go see it, or they told you to skip it. And by watching them argue about it, you didn't just hear 2 opinions, you actually came away understanding the movie better, because you'd seen it from both sides. Now obviously, Siskel and Ebert were incredibly stubborn, but beneath that stubbornness, on rare occasions, if an argument was truly undeniable or a talent was just too bright to ignore, they were actually capable of doing the unthinkable in today's media landscape, admitting that they were wrong. During the review of Broken Arrow, Siskel initially gave the film a thumbs up, but as Ebert mercilessly picked apart the movie's logic and flaws right in front of him, you can actually see Siskel begin to reconsider his rating in real time. And then something happens that almost never happens in film criticism. Siskel admits he was wrong and literally twists his thumb from up to down. Of course, because it's Siskel and Ebert, the moment doesn't end there. As soon as Siskel concedes, he immediately turns to Ebert and asks for one favor in return: look into the camera and admit that he was wrong about Cop and a Half, a movie Ebert famously defended that Siskel absolutely despised. Ebert flat out refuses. And within seconds, they're right back at it, arguing about Cop and a Half all over again. Ebert tries to defend his original take, insisting that he saw things in Cop and a Half that he really admires, only for Siskel to fire back, yeah, that no one else saw. When Jim Carrey first exploded onto the scene with movies like Ace Ventura and The Mask, both Siskel and Ebert trashed him and his movies, calling him obnoxious and his films some of the worst they'd seen. But instead of blindly holding on to that initial hatred, over time they started to reassess what he was actually doing and realized that his unparalleled physical comedy was a generational talent. Eventually, they dedicated an entire episode to him, to both admit that they were wrong and to celebrate his genius. That kind of humility is almost completely gone now. A similar thing happened with David Lynch. When Lynch released Blue Velvet in 1986, Ebert absolutely hated it. He was morally outraged by the film, claimed that Lynch exploited actress Isabella Rossellini, and gave it a brutal review, while Siskel defended it. But years later, when Lynch released Mulholland Drive, Ebert had a completely different reaction. He loved it. Still, when the two of them crossed paths on the red carpet, you could tell Lynch still harbored some resentment over Ebert's very public and somewhat misguided criticism of Blue Velvet. However, the tension broke when Ebert immediately began gushing over Mulholland Drive, even admitting he didn't fully understand it. Now, can you imagine a film critic today openly admitting they didn't understand a movie? Most would probably be embarrassed to reveal that. After all, film analysis is literally their job. But Ebert didn't care. He didn't need to fully get it to recognize its value, and told Lynch that he understood it emotionally. Lynch softened and completely agreed, validating that feeling it was actually what mattered, before warmly thanking Ebert for all that he did to champion the film as the two seemed to mend cinematic fences. But perhaps the most important thing Siskel and Ebert did with their show wasn't tearing down bad movies, it was using their massive, nationally syndicated platform to advocate for brilliant but often ignored films. Take Hoop Dreams, for example, a small documentary with no stars, no franchise, no built-in audience. Most critics would have treated it as a niche release. Instead, Siskel and Ebert elevated it, repeatedly praising it and pushing audiences to seek it out. It went from being just another indie documentary to being widely recognized as one of the greatest films of the decade. Same goes for My Dinner with Andre, which stayed in theaters for nearly a year thanks to their support. And that's really the thing about them. They didn't just react to the culture, they tried to shape it. You can see that most clearly with Roger Ebert's long-standing support of Martin Scorsese. Years before the Academy finally gave Scorsese his long overdue Oscar, Ebert famously and repeatedly declared Scorsese to be the greatest active American filmmaker. And they also weren't afraid to call out the industry when they felt they got it wrong. When Do the Right Thing was famously snubbed by the Academy, both were outraged. They didn't just shrug it off as another award season oversight, they publicly criticized the decision, arguing that the film was one of the most important and vital works of its time. But maybe the greatest example of one of them defending the medium didn't even happen on their show. It happened at the Sundance Film Festival in 2002. Director Justin Lin had just premiered his independent film Better Luck Tomorrow, which focused on a group of high-achieving Asian American teenagers who sink into a world of violent crime. During the post-film Q&A, an angry audience member stood up and demanded to know why Lin would portray Asian Americans in such a negative, destructive light. Enraged, Ebert stood up in the crowd and furiously pointed out that nobody would say that to white filmmakers, and yelled that Asian filmmakers have every right to make their characters just as flawed, complex, and messed up as anybody else. And that's the kind of thing that made them different. They weren't just critics sitting on the sidelines handing out scores, they were active participants in the conversation around cinema. They used their voice to elevate filmmakers, challenge institutions, and to defend the idea that movies, no matter how small, controversial, or unconventional, deserve to exist on their own terms. And that's really the difference. Today, movie criticism has been flattened into a number. And while in a lot of ways it works, it's also completely lifeless. Because what made Siskel and Ebert special wasn't that they were always right, had perfect taste, or that their thumbs were somehow more accurate than a modern score. It's that they turned criticism into a conversation. One where you could disagree, change your mind, defend something you loved, or tear apart something that didn't work. And maybe that's why I miss them. Not because they were the last great critics, but because they were the last ones who made arguing about movies feel like it actually mattered. However, if you want to keep their spirit alive right now, the exact same rating system they used is sitting right below this video. So, in their honor, if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Just make sure you head down into the comments afterwards and argue about it while fiercely defending your rating. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Hollywood Deep Dives.